Hello and welcome to Maiden, Matriarch with me, Louise. My guest today is Erika Bachiochi. She is an American legal scholar and the director of the Wollstonecraft Project at the Abigail Adams Institute, and also a fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Centre. We spoke about her latest book, The Rights of Woman, which is about Mary Wollstonecraft and her legacy and all the many things that people tend to get wrong in interpreting Wollstonecraft's work. And the extended section, we also talked about how Erika went from being a socialist feminist to a Catholic mother of seven. As always, you can find that extended version of the podcast at my Substack, louiseperry.substack.com. And you can also find bonus episodes and the MMM chat community. Enjoy. So, Erika, I went today I was at the British Library already in London and rereading your book on Wollstonecraft. And I suddenly remembered that she's not actually buried there, but there's her original grave and her memorial is about a 3-minute walk from the British Library in the Old St Pancras churchyard, which I'd never been to before. So I thought I'll go in the rain and it will be very atmospheric, which it was. Um, Found the grave, which took ages, and people leave things on the grave. I don't know if you've been. And on top is a sort of plinth, and on top people had left pens, which kind of makes sense. There was a little statue of an angel and some lace and some tampons. And yeah, I wasn't so sure about that one. And the thing that really struck out to me and I wanted to tell you about was a pro-abortion badge.
Mm.
And I thought Erika will have something to say about this because that's a really fundamental aspect, actually, which I don't think many people know about pre-second wave feminism, the relationship to abortion. Do you want to start from there?
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's an interesting in how I sort of came back to reading Mary Wollstonecraft. I had read her as a women's studies student at Middlebury College in the 1990s, a long, long time ago, and then had my own kind of intellectual, I guess, conversion, you might say, and started studying the ancients, Aristotle, Plato, um, and really kind of got deeply into political theory and then became a lawyer. Sort of work in my scholarship at the intersection of constitutional law, political and legal theory, and feminism. And so I came back to Wollstonecraft about 8 years ago, and the reason I did so was because I'd been working on kind of questions that have been really animated constitutional law and the work I do in equal protection clause of the 14th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution have really animated, the kind of reading of that text for the last 40, 50 years. And that is kind of questions of abortion and questions of whether abortion rights are necessary to women's equality. And I had written a lot about this, and I had, in fact, written kind of a debunking of the kind of central claim that abortion rights are necessary to women's equality by, trying to show how, when we sort of put abortion, this capacity to end the life of one's own child, at sort of the center, which it really did become second wave feminism, of women's kind of claims for equality, claims for freedom, there's a way in which, because of reproductive asymmetry, because of the fact that men and women engage in the same sexual act, but it is women who can bear children, become pregnant and bear children, that we're really kind of taking a male standard of equality, the ability to walk away from that sexual act, because obviously women have to engage in this kind of violence against their own child in order to attain the kind of autonomy that equal autonomy that is sort of hailed in second wave and beyond feminism. So I'd really looked at these claims for equal protection, which became sort of the prevailing way to think about abortion rights in the United States. And I wanted to get behind these claims, to understand their rights claims better. So someone like Ruth Bader Ginsburg's rights claims. Ruth Bader Ginsburg, of course, is sort of the iconic second wave, feminist thinker, because she really is rightly hailed, I think, as as having the court, convincing really a unanimous court in the 1970s to um, see the Equal Protection Clause as applying to women as well, that they shouldn't be arbitrarily discriminated because they have capacity for, becoming mothers. And so I wanted to get behind her rights claims, because I thought, how is it that a woman who sees that so clearly would understand this, that there's a central right to end the life of one's child? And so I went back, and I'd already known our first wave women's rights advocates in our country, and the way in which they were really opposed to abortion, morally, especially. They really saw, we knew scientifically in terms of biology that abortion ended the life of a child. And so they understood their rights as being necessary to carry out their duties, the duties they had to their children. So I was like, where did this all come from? And what's the change in sort of rights theory, basically? And so what I came to see is those earliest women's rights advocates who, again, grounded those claims in, if you go back and look at the document at Seneca Falls, the Declaration of Sentiments and Resolutions, they're really calling upon, their sort of equal claim as being creatures of, a creator, right? That they have this equal dignity because they're creatures equal in that way to men, and that they have these responsibilities in society and to their families. And so they ought to have these political and civil rights, of course, we can talk more about. And so where did these come from? And so what I came to see was that they had all been reading Mary Wollstonecraft. Lucretia Mott, co-author of that declaration, as well as Elizabeth Cady Stanton, but then others like Sarah Grimke, who is a kind of a really big, important thinker in the mid-19th century, who wrote an important text called The Letters on the Equality of the Sexes. So I wanted to go back and read Mary Wollstonecraft. And so when I did, I was sort of dumbfounded by what I discovered there. And I really wanted to read everything that she wrote once I went back and read A Vindication of the Rights of Women, because I hadn't remembered her the way I read her. And I think we can talk a lot about this, but I think a lot of that is how she's presented and how she's remembered. And I think there's a way in which, Louise, that I've been thinking a lot about this lately, that she sort of stands for how the sort of interpretations of her almost give a window into how we think, how sort of women have entered into the academy, have entered into the intellectual life. And I think so she's remembered depending on sort of people's priors in some sense, or how they regard her a lot. Anyway, we can get into that, but I think she's, widely regarded until probably the last 30 years as kind of a Enlightenment rationalist. She's kind of thinks just like the men around her, an anti-religious romantic, an egalitarian. She thought for women's rights, she must be an egalitarian. Even an sort of sharing the views of her, short-lived husband, William Godwin, in terms of anarchy, in terms of being anti-marriage or supporting free love or something. And these are all, you just have to go to the text and read her and discover that none of this is true. So, yes, so she is also very clear. She doesn't speak a lot about abortion. She does in one of her texts, The Wrongs of Women, show how women, had abortions out of desperation. But she does talk about how there are certain maternal duties that women have when they engage in sex, and that sex is ordered to both procreation and sort of, coming together. She talks about sort of there's this animal nature of sex, but then there's this parental purpose of sex. And that when we don't sort of look at those twin purposes, that we use sex in an animalistic way. And that when we do that in terms of kind of putting lust and passion ahead of principle, that women are kind of left alone with the consequences. And so she says actually that the best thing to deal with sort of this problem with both morals and population, as she said, is for men to maintain both mother and child. She says that very clearly, and that would really help. And so there it is. I mean, what I regard to be sort of the way out of this puzzle is really engaged fatherhood, which those early women's rights advocates very much followed Wollstonecraft on, and I think is we're coming back to seeing how important that is today.
It's probably worth talking a little bit about Wollstonecraft's biography, even though, of course, her biography has, in a sense, been often been abused or misused in terms of falsely representing um, her ideologically. Um, but do you want to explain a little bit about it? Because I think it is important, particularly in terms of her thoughts on motherhood and fatherhood.
It is true, so that she really was remembered right away for just her sort of tragic personal life. And that's because her, again, short lived husband, William Godwin, published a biography soon after she died. And I think really misunderstood her in a lot of ways. Obviously, they had an important intimacy. They bore a child together, the famous Mary Shelley, author of Frankenstein. But I think there was a lot that he misunderstood. He certainly did not appreciate her rights of woman, the vindication of the rights of woman. He actually told her that when he first met her. And he certainly didn't he was a sort of committed atheist. He certainly didn't understand her religiosity. So there's a lot in that biography that just was made her deeply misunderstood. And so then she wasn't read. And so then that she was sort of lionized for those very reasons that William Godwin sort of presented her as this kind of figure of free love. And again, she wasn't read. So what is her biography? Well, it starts kind of tragically. She was the oldest daughter of a family, and she's a English woman, and she had an alcoholic father who she sometimes, I don't know how many occasions this would happen, but would hear raping her mother. Um, she she ended up having to really be the caretaker of her younger siblings, and so she really needed kind of an independence, like a financial independence, very early on. She had a dear friend, Fanny, who died in childbirth. She had another friend, or sorry, her sister got into a very abusive relationship, had a child, and then had to leave the marriage for her own safety. And because of the marital laws that existed, her father, the father of the child, had retained custody of the child, and then the child ended up dying. So there's just a lot of deep tragedy early in her life. She goes on to become a schoolmistress. She founds a school in Newington Green with, I think, two of her sisters. And there she writes her first book, The Education of Her Daughters, which really, I think, importantly, a lot of these early texts of hers aren't read. That book, her fiction, original stories, her book, The Female Reader, which brings together Shakespeare and Milton and excerpts from the Bible in order to sort of edify young women in particular. She talks about in that thoughts of on the education of daughters. She has this key line that I think is sort of opens up all of her work to help understand her. She says the main business of our lives is to learn to be virtuous. And so in all of those texts, she's really trying to help young girls and women stop being so concerned about their outward appearance and sort of becoming sort of ingratiating themselves to men through beauty. And she really wants them to become strong of mind and virtuous. She then, in the Vindication of the Rights of Women, will take on Rousseau's theory, which what we can get to. But after she founds the school, she comes into she becomes a congregant. She's Anglican by religious practice, but becomes a congregant as well of the Reverend Richard Price, who is a moralist, kind of a follower, and very much I talk about in my book, in a conversant with American revolutionaries. And when the French Revolution rolls around, there's sort of this hope among these people like Price, who sees the American Revolution, he says, as next to Christianity, the greatest hope for mankind, basically, and that there's this that they see in the American Revolution the twin sort of goals of freedom and virtue together, just the sort of deep, sort of small R Republican view that Wollstonecraft also shared. And so when the French Revolution comes around, there's this hope that here too will be a place where instead of this this focus of their aristocracy and the monarchy on property and honors and kind of what they saw as not being, even though there was the appearances or the illusions of acquiring virtue, that really that the deep inequality and the deep corruption of focusing so much on property and honors had kept even those who had those honors from really attaining virtue, and that the poor were sort of just imitating the rich, and again not acquiring true virtue. So she then engages in this big sort of dispute with Edmund Burke, who was had was seeking to uh, defend the monarchy against those early French revolutionaries. And so part of what she's doing there is because Edmund Burke had critiqued her teacher Richard Price, and so it's that piece of hers, the Vindication of the Rights of Men, is a very angry piece. There's a lot of kind of ad hominem attack, but she's going up against Burke with sort of, I would say, natural law principles. She's saying to him, how can you just like things that are old? How do you argue against slavery? Why aren't you just a Catholic? How do you critique any of these things? So, and for that reason, I think because Burke is so hailed as this kind of conservative giant of tradition, she's seen as this adherent of the French Revolution. And that's not quite right, because she then goes to Paris as a reporter, and she sees the reign of terror in front of her eyes, and she cries as the king is brought to the guillotine, and she sees the wrong that's happened by this sort of abstraction of liberty, instead of understanding kind of the moral duties that she sees as to be so necessary for natural rights.
Can I just ask for a moment that so
Mm.
were people not amazed at this still young, still in her 20s or maybe early 30s
30s, yeah.
woman who's schoolmistress, writing against Burke? Was that was that in itself kind of scandalous?
Yeah, no, that's right. It's first anonymous. And what's kind of amazing about it, and it's the part that sort of aggravates me about it, because she was so sort of taken up in passion about him insulting a man who was very highly regarded, Richard Price, for his real sanctity. Uh, Abigail Adams wrote that he has a charity. Abigail Adams and John Adams were congregants in his parish in Newington Green, and said his charity was just kind of overpouring for all of mankind, says Abigail. So he had this great reputation. And so the fact that he was critiqued by Burke, she's very animated by it. And so yes, very much. It's anonymous. She then, but what happens is she writes a page and she sends it to the printer. She writes a page and she sends it to the printer. So there's like no editing process at all. And so it really is a very sort of passionate display, but it also was one of the most widely read. It's certainly the first critique of Burke, but then it's one of the most widely read, at least in the United States. Thomas Paine is also widely read, but it's fascinating that in the United States, especially among those early women's rights advocates, it was Wollstonecraft they were reading and not Paine, because Paine takes much more of a pro-French Revolution approach, whereas in my reading, and I think a lot of scholars reading, Wollstonecraft has much more of an American flavor, because there's not sort of this abstraction around rights or liberty. It's always safeguarded and by these prior duties, that really what we are as human beings, as rational creatures, are those who have duties to others, duties to God, duties to our children and our spouse, and our fellow creatures, as she would say, and that's why we need these rights. And so there's not just sort of natural rights to go and do whatever you will, which was the danger of the French Revolution.
So people at this stage didn't know that the anonymous writer of this critique was female.
Mm-hmm. That's right.
Like that Virginia Woolf line, right, about anonymous has historically been a woman. Okay, so she has that text. How much longer is it until she sits down to write Vindication of the Rights of Women?
It's very soon after. Um, and she's really building on a lot of those themes, but I think she's especially interested in the way in which Burke and then Rousseau, two very, very different thinkers at that time, really have a strongly gendered account of virtue. So, in some sense, they're all interested in the importance of the family and the inculcation of virtue for the public good. And certainly Rousseau and Burke have very, very different ideas of what that public good looks like. But she too wanted to sort of enter this conversation and very much agreed that that this inculcation of virtue was important to carrying on and sort of having um, public actors be virtuous. And so she wanted to kind of get into why it was, as she says, that she throws down her gauntlet against this idea of sexed virtues. And I think this is a really, really important aspect of her thought, and perhaps the most important, is because she understands virtue as she says, I build my morality on the perfection of God. She understands there's one source of virtue, and that is the goodness of God. And because God is um, all good and all wise, that when human beings imitate God as rational creatures, as those who have been given reason as kind of a light in order to obviously know um, all things, but certainly in terms of conscience, right from wrong, and those types of things, that there can't be a way in which virtue is sex, that there are these masculine and feminine virtues. And I want to get to, she certainly doesn't think men and women are the same. And she gives quite an account of their difference and the way in which male and female characters in virtuously carrying out their very distinctive duties, especially due to what we would now call reproductive asymmetry, just the distinctive reproductive contributions and roles, that their characters may look very, very different as they carry out those virtues, right? And so she talks about a maternal and a paternal character, and I think that that's sort of a distinctive way, right? And so women are not just called to sort of be modest and chaste, which is how feminine virtue was understood, especially by Rousseau. For those who don't remember their Rousseau, in the Emile, he sort of sets up Sophie as his female character, and in A Vindication of the Rights of Women, this is exactly what I mean. He's the Emile and Sophie is her chief kind of interlocutor. She says at some point, I want a diametrically opposed education for girls that the one Rousseau has set up. Why? Because he sees men as strong and women as weak, and women are meant to, by their kind of beauty and feminine wiles and their cunning, to manipulate men to do what they wish. And so they ought not only be chaste, they should have a reputation for chastity. And that was how they were sort of going to rule over men, because of men's sort of stronger passions. So she doesn't disagree that men have stronger sort of sexual passions, but she thinks that a power play, even if one exists between men and women, is not good for a relationship between them and sort of the health of their marriage, but then also how they would inculcate virtue in their children. She says, I want, women to have power over themselves, and I want men to have power over themselves through self-mastery, through this acquisition of virtue, so that then they can treat one another with a great deal of respect, and that they can build, she says, love the other on account of their virtues. So build a friendship based on this sort of working toward for both of them for virtue.
So a kind of, she sees a complementarity, but derived from the same vision of virtue. Can we pause for a moment and talk a little about Rousseau's biography? Because I've got to say, I didn't know, when I was first introduced to Wollstonecraft and to Rousseau as an undergraduate, I must have read a little bit of the primary text. I don't remember exactly now, but I remember being aware of Wollstonecraft's, slightly scandalous sexual life. That that came part and parcel, it seems, with her reputation as a writer, for a 19-year-old being newly introduced to her. It wasn't for years that I discovered what Rousseau got up to, specifically in relation to his children, and and knowing that is so much more scandalous than anything that Wollstonecraft did.
Exactly. It's really true. Yeah. I mean, I guess I didn't. So, right. So he abandons, I mean, he has a mistress and then abandons each of his 5 children to an orphanage, even though he's like this great writer of, education and remembered. Whereas I guess I never finished Wollstonecraft. Like, what's the scandal there? after she writes these texts, when she's in France, she goes on and she meets this American entrepreneur, Gilbert Imlay, and he he marries her. Well, he says they're married to protect her from being killed as a English woman, and as the Jacobins had taken over, and when she was in France. But they do have they're held out as being married, but they're not actually civilly married. But they do have a child together. And so when she goes on to marry, he abandons her for another woman. And so in some ways, he represents exactly the kind of man that she had warned people against in her Vindication of the Rights of Men, like this sort of libidinous man who doesn't have the kind of delicacy of feeling to not use women, basically. So she attempts suicide at that point. And now remember, she's just had a child. She's been left in France alone. She has very little means to take care of herself and her child. We now know a lot about postpartum depression. I mean, who knows what was going on? I mean, I just always am kind of astonished when people would say, "Oh, it's so scandalous that she, tried to take her own life." And I sort of think, "But for the grace of God, go I." Um, she then marries Godwin, and because she marries Godwin, and people thought she was married to Imlay, there's this big scandal at that point, like, oh, she was never married to Imlay. And so that's part of it. And then she also had, conceived a child with Godwin before they were married. It's really important. I think we look back and think this is some think this is so scandalous. And yet the marital laws at that time, she experienced very clearly, where, not only would she lose, the right to care for her own children, had there been something that would have gone awry in those marriages, which she saw things like that happen in her own life, but she would have lost all property rights. She would have lost all contract rights. I mean, all these through coverture, the common law, you know, um, governance of marriage at that point. She becomes one with her husband, and she loses all those civil rights. And so, for a woman who has seen sort of vicious men, take advantage of women, it seems very clear to me and very reasonable that she would act in this way. But yes, Rousseau and a lot of other men, we don't seem to care much about their biographies, and yet we know how to nitpick hers, which I think tells
Mm.
us a lot about sort of how great women thinkers are still viewed sometimes.
I didn't appreciate that chronology. So she wrote Vindication of the Rights of Women before she was abandoned by Imlay. So
That's
actually,
right.
because I had sort
Hmm.
of assumed that there was bitter experience being expressed when she warns against the lack of chastity in
Hmm.
men and so on. But no, um, she just got
No.
terribly unlucky.
Yeah, and so she has this high vision. I mean, I think she warns about it because of what she'd seen, right, in her friends and her family and her own parents. But she hadn't experienced it yet, and so that's why it's sort of so tragic, right? Because she meets this man, she thinks he's this new man who's going to treat her with great delicacy and care and respect, and yet there he goes philandering.
Was he also sort of i- imbued with this revolutionary spirit? Was he coming from the same kind of idealistic group that she'd been drawn to?
He, I think, is running in similar circles. Again, she's not at that point. She's sort of taken. She's come to France to report on the revolution, which she's started to not be. I would say partial to, right? So things are starting to make her very nervous. And the Jacobins begin to take over, and at that point, she wants no part in it. So he is actually an entrepreneur from America, interestingly enough, and so is there to kind of make a buck. And so I don't know, I think that they shared sort of fellow feeling and all sorts of things like that. I don't know that they shared sort of intellectual philosophy, and others may know more about that, but I'm not quite sure.
It reminded me just for a moment of I'm writing an essay about Andrea Dworkin for the Free Press that I've been working on this week,
Mm,
and it's weirdly she has a slightly similar biography in that she ran away to Europe
mm,
um, and um, and was married to and abused by a sort of fellow radical. moving in the anarchist circles that she was
Mm.
moving in, and that marriage fell apart, and then she ended up having famous marriage to John Stoltenberg, and he has, in her death, somewhat misrepresented Andrew Dworkin. There's funny parallels
Mm.
between the two of them, of course. Although, of course, Dworkin didn't have any children.
And she was there to tell her side of things, whereas Wollstonecraft died after, right? And so couldn't defend herself against this biography. I think her sisters tried to, but to no avail.
Hmm. How was A Vindication of the Rights of Women received in her day?
Yeah, so early on, I think there's a lot of interest in it. I think right away in Britain, Scandal, it's very short number of years between when she published that and when she dies and this biography comes out. It reemerges in Britain for when claims for suffrage and women's rights begin, but even sooner than that in the United States. So you have someone, you have the abolitionist movement, which she too was pretty articulate with, especially with her in her back and forth, or not back and forth, but in her critique of Burke. And so you have very early on Sarah Grimke reading Vindication of the Rights of Women in 1820. You have Lucretia Mott reading then so that by the time 1840, when she and Elizabeth Cady Stanton are talking at this abolitionist convention, and they are not allowed in because they're women, and they both sort of realize that they both read Wollstonecraft's work and that they need to have make some claims for women's rights of their own, especially because these men aren't allowing them to even speak for righteous causes like abolition. And so that's when you start to see her her passage, I guess, across the Atlantic. However, there's an even earlier passage, which is that through the John and Abigail Adams. So John Adams, when he's actually vice president, he reads Wollstonecraft's essay on the French Revolution, and he reads it actually twice. People have found the marginella of his sort of reading. Abigail Adams calls herself Wollstonecraft's pupil, and so there's sort of this early reception of her thought, which to me, in reading it and knowing the American founders really well, makes a lot of sense given her being this smaller Republican and being particularly interested in the way in which liberty and constitutional government would allow for an equal understanding of sort of human dignity that she saw to be just basic in a Christian anthropology in the Imago Dei, right? And so for her, that the need to imitate God and imitate sort of, as she says, the divine patterns is and sort of inculcate virtue in children. All of that is just part and parcel of the American understanding of the experiment in ordered liberty. And so there's an obvious kinship between the founders and her thought. So I get why she's given sort of this early passage and she's read more in America perhaps than otherwise.
And so did she know John and Abigail Adams personally as well through the congregation in London?
Yeah, so we don't know whether they knew one another as far as I can tell. We just know that they were congregants in Richard's Price congregation. So I'm not sure. There may be others who know that better than me.
Okay, but there's potentially quite a good chance.
Yeah.
At what point do you think she develops this reputation for being this crucial first feminist, as she is now remembered? And now we have women, we can assume, leaving tokens on her memorial. Where do you think that kind of
Yeah.
reputation develops?
Yeah, I mean, I think it comes in two waves, just like the first and second wave. So with the first wave, those early women's rights advocates, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, who are kind of most remembered for their work on suffrage, though in my book, I argue that there were others who probably had more to do with actually pushing women's suffrage through. When they opened their newspaper, The Revolution, they put her portrait on the wall next to Lucretia Mott's And so, there's sort of this hailing of her thought. She's um, remembered sort of in assemblies and conventions and that sort of thing. And you can sort of read her account of rights as necessary to carry out duties in that Seneca Falls Declaration of Sentiments and Resolutions. I read her thought as very much grounded in what we would now understand as natural law, right? This view of who are we as rational creatures, where we are moral agents, we are deeply interdependent, we are therefore relational, and we have duties to one another. And so all of that is very implicit, I would say, in that statement if you go and read it. So then, once you then have, in some sense, feminism as we know it is quiet after in the United States after 1920. There's certainly, and I catalog all of this in my book. There's a lot of debates among sort of, you would say, kind of communitarians versus libertarians in fights over when women enter the workplace. How should women be treated? And so there's all sorts of debates early on in the 20th century. But then after, FDR comes to power, and you start to see a lot more sort of good labor law in the United States, there's just not as much impetus for a great sort of women's rights movement. And then you have a real change of the guard, I would say, that starts with Margaret Sanger. And so there's a real shift away from a Wollstonecraft kind of seeing immiseration caused by kind of the want of chastity in men or the want of virtue in women, to seeing kind of the female body as where, there's, we need to respond to fertility and to reproductive asymmetry through technology. And so, right, around that time when feminism starts to reboot itself with an interest in abortion and contraception, especially, and Simone de Beauvoir and others, there's now an interest in her sort of reputation. And she's lionized at that point as this figure who Godwin had remembered, for free love and all of that. And again, not read. And so it's not until like 30 years ago when women are starting to enter the academy as political theorists, not as advocates, not as activists, but as actual political theorists who are reading her work, that you start to then see her reemerge within sort of women's studies and then gender studies, but also in history and political science. And you start to see kind of the complexity of her views. And people start to situate her differently. She's no longer thought of among scholars as kind of this rationalist or kind of Lockean liberal. I think some scholars still have a harder time situating her religiosity, which becomes very clear when you read her, especially her early work, especially some really beautiful prayers that have been sort of shown her deep kind of Christian faith. But I think even now there are scholars. A theologian recently wrote a really beautiful book that kind of situates her um, her understanding of the Imago Dei again, her Christian faith as that both men and women share as rational creatures in this the image of God, and therefore, ought to be called upon to as moral agents to live lives of virtue and carry out their duties to others, and that we need rights for that.
I want to get back to this question of abortion, but in a sense, what I'm really getting back to is this issue of Wollstonecraft's Christianity, because I think that it's the same thing, right? That we're talking about the opposition to abortion is so deeply rooted in her faith. And one of the things that I didn't know before reading you, I should say that I am one of the epigraphs that I chose for the case against the sexual revolution. I got because because of reading you, and you're drawing my attention to the quote from Wollstonecraft. I can't remember exactly what it is now, but it's something about the greatest miseries that beget womankind are caused by the lack of chastity in men, right? Which is a source of great interest to her, right, throughout the book. I didn't know before reading you and some other women political theorists that before the second wave, pretty much, all feminists were pro-life. Would you say that's a fair characterization?
Mm-hmm.
And many of them were very, very faithful
Yeah,
Christians. And I have since
that's
gone
right.
away and read some of those women. who I'd never come across before,
Mhm.
and was very surprised. And I actually mentioned this recently when I was in conversation with a libertarian uh, American who I won't name. And I said this, and she just did not believe me. She did not believe me. Like
Mhm.
this whole period of the first wave and before has been so memory hold
That's right.
and misrepresented.
And I mean, I think what's fascinating is that many of them were Quakers. So Lucretia Mott, Sarah Grimke. I mean, Sarah Grimke has the most beautiful account of Genesis. She goes back to, using the original text to say, when, God says that man will rule over woman, he's not being prescriptive but descriptive. He's describing what happens after the fall. And I think it's a beautiful text in which she also shares a lot of this view that because we are responsible to God for our lives, because we are these moral agents, um, that we need to have this full and robust liberal education as men do. That we shouldn't be sort of these ornaments, these sort of beauties to behold, or just to manipulate our men through our feminine wiles or something. That we're like serious, that we have rational minds, and that we have these responsibilities. And I think that's where this real focus, I think, on responsibility and those duties of care that men and women both have was very, very pivotal in that first wave. And so, when they're really aghast at kind of the way in which men are kind of let off the hook for abortion, and women are blamed. And one of the ways that they respond to that early on is through what they call voluntary motherhood. And it's this view that, look, if women are the ones who are responsible for unborn life and then for nurturing new life, through nursing and through early care of children, then we should be the ones who, as Sarah Grimke puts it in her essay, Marriage, control all preliminaries. And by what she meant was that we shouldn't be raped at when we're married or otherwise. But for these women, there's this male sexual prerogative that comes about through an understanding of the common law, through something called consortium, where basically women are understood as property of their husbands, and so they can kind of do with them what they will. But it also comes about through a really, I think, harsh reading of scripture, and where as though men can sort of rule over women's bodies and take them sexually whenever they want. And so there's a real pushback against that, um, especially because of the duties of care that women owed to their children, but also because they very much value chaste love, and they talk about that. I mean, that how horrible it is to enter into marriage thinking that we're going to become like two together, and have this deep love, and then I'm taken through when I am not willing to become a mother because I have four other children, or because of sickness, or because of whatever, because I'm just not capable of it right now. That my husband would go and presume that he could have sex with me. And so this is a big, and so there is a call for bodily autonomy, right? But it's an autonomy to sort of even bodily ownership, the way that sort of second wave feminists are apt to talk about abortion. But what they're talking about is, an ownership and an autonomy to control what I do with my body. And I'm not, going to, because of the responsibilities that come with conceiving a child, because of the duties of care I owe to that child. And so that's very much a theme in among those early women's rights advocates.
So crucially, they recognise the value of women being able to choose when they become mothers, but their solution is not abortion or contraception. Their solution is male restraint.
Hmm.
And
That's right. Yeah,
it seems to me, and I think it seems to you, that expectation of male restraint was to some extent abandoned at the time, not consistently across the board, but in the mainstream of feminism. That expectation has to some extent been abandoned, and we have a technological solution instead.
that's right. I think it's helpful just to, I usually do all sorts of quoting, which I listen to other people quote on podcasts, and you're sort of like trying to follow them. But I think it's really helpful just to hear one from the Declaration of Sentiments and Resolutions, just to put sort of a fine point on it. So sort of people get like, this is what they were really, one of the claims that they were really up to. They wanted to be able to speak in public. They wanted to be able to hold, to be able to, enter into education and the professions and all that. But here's one of their resolutions: that the same amount of virtue, delicacy, and refinement of behavior that is required of women in the social state should also be required of man. And the same transgression should be visited with equal severity on both man and woman. And I mean, it's very similar to here going back, and I do a lot of comparison in my book to these women and Wollstonecraft, but she says, chastity, modesty, public spirit, and all the noble train of virtues on which social virtue and happiness are built should be understood and cultivated by all of mankind, or they will be cultivated to little effect. And so there's this understanding, like, we're all called to cultivate honesty and courage and moderation, and yes, chastity and modesty and all of that, both men and women. There isn't kind of a set like, oh, courage and justice is for men and chastity and modesty is for women. No, all of us are called to all of that. Why? Because there's this idea that we're responsible to God as rational creatures, and that's how we will have, as Wollstonecraft says in that package, how we will become happy, how we will become free, that we're not beholden to our kind of lower appetites or our desires, even though those give life, great kind of pleasure and goodness, but where we ought to be, live according to the highest principle in us, which is our reason, right? And that reason is very much open. It's not sort of this, modern kind of rationalism that's like, calculating reason or logic, but it's kind of open up to all of reality. And so I want to read one more where Wollstonecraft has her protagonist in the original story say, "We are all dependent on each other." So she's very cognizant in a way that those her fellow Enlightenment thinkers, Hobbes, Locke, etc., wanted to talk about sort of independence and autonomy, because maybe men are a bit able to live that more than women. But she says we are all dependent on each other, and this dependence is wisely ordered by our Heavenly Father to call forth many virtues, to exercise the best affections of the human heart and fix them into habits. And so there's just always like this desire to help form that. Mother and fatherhood are such noble kind of occupations and callings, because what mothers and fathers are doing with very, very young children. She was especially an advocate of nursing for women, because of those affections that are inculcated, and virtues that are inculcated in very young children, that help them to live, happy and free, independent lives as they grow older.
In a sense, what she's asking of men is that they adopt feminine virtues rather than rejecting them. So in the
Yeah,
nurturing of
yeah,
children, and in chastity and all these things, which of course are deeply rooted in Christianity as well. Whereas you open your book by talking about the pussy hats phenomenon and the kind of anti-Trump protests in America, which actually were, as with so much, I would say, of 20th and 21st century liberal feminism, is about imitating men, and not necessarily imitating masculine virtues either, but actually often imitating masculine excesses, masculine misbehavior.
right,
Being through
right.
casual sex, through being sort of crude and aggressive and whatever it might be, which is really diametrically opposed actually to
Hmm.
what Wollstonecraft is saying.
Yeah. I mean, there was a way in which, and her rhetoric lends to this, where she talks about how women should acquire more masculine virtues. And then she kind of says, but masculine is kind of a bugbear. Like, really, I don't want virtue to be sex because of this unitary, source in God. But yeah, I mean, effectively, it's like what traditionally was hailed in men should be acquired by women. What was traditionally hailed in women should be acquired in men. Why? So that we can have the fullness of being human persons, who have this respect for one another. And yeah, I mean, I think that that's right. And there's a way in which, I mean, Aristotle saw this, that it's easier for men to be, or that men, not so much that it's easier, but there's a way in which, because men are prone, because of now we know testosterone, to risk taking, that, courage is something that they potentially have sort of a more natural affinity for, right? And I think because women have, the capacity to bear children and therefore become very vulnerable when they do so, and can become more dependent on those around them, and especially men, the father of their child. That moderation, Aristotle says, is something that women have more of a propensity to, right? She's going to be moderate in who she engages in sex with if she's thinking clearly, because of that vulnerability that befalls her, right? So the question is whether or not it's important for men to take on this important chastity and moderation, which, as you say, Christianity really called men to, and whether women should be courageous and have great fortitude, which I would say Christianity also called women to. I mean, some of the great saints, female saints, had great courage in speaking out for kind of righteous causes and all of that. So yeah, I think there is a way in which that certainly is what Christianity does for, and the Christian virtues call all people to.
Do you think it would be fair to say that Wollstonecraft is an early proponent of the kind of blurring of gender distinctions and actually the breaking down of gender roles, which has now become such a fundamental aspect of um, feminism, particularly in the academy? Or do you think she's doing something quite different from what we now see?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's um, a way in which she's very clear about the distinction between, um, you would say, blurring or questioning maybe you could even use the social construction of um, how we thought about virtue, and what was required in terms of virtue, what society thought kind of the excellences of women and the excellence of men look like. And so I think in that way, she's trying to say, um, no, you can have a, incredibly intelligent woman or an incredibly courageous woman. Um, and in the same way, she, I guess, would, as we've just said, call men to something that maybe, uh, Homer wasn't as interested in terms of male roles. But I think she's very clear about biological and reproductive differences. Not only reproductive differences, that again, they're mothers and they're fathers and they have different roles, and that nursing especially is really kind of an important place where women can grow in excellence. And but also that um, yeah, I mean, I guess the maternal and the paternal roles. I guess what I was going to say that it skipped my thought was the way in which he talks about physical strength, and that she says it's very clear that men have far more physical strength. And she's not, as I mentioned at the beginning, she's not an egalitarian where she just states men and women are equal. She actually says men and women have this equal call to virtue. They're equally rational creatures. They're equally responsible to God. But whether or not, men could be potentially more virtuous, we need to see whether that's the case. Maybe they are. Maybe they are potentially more virtuous because of this greater physical strength, right? But we don't know because we've kept real, kind of rigorous education and moral formation from women. We've kept them from understanding kind of the end that they have in life, which is this greater development.
The comments on breastfeeding were interesting to me because I did work as a graduate student on wet nursing, which at the time was in her era was popular among the upper classes. And as you related, she was quite condemnatory of um, upper class preference for wet nursing, and indeed upper class preference for um, outsourcing the work of both motherhood and fatherhood to servants. And not only because it meant having a less close relationship with children, but also that feeling that there's something ennobling for both men and women about doing that work themselves. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. She actually kind of analogizes women at that time to the rich, that there's a way in which aristocratic women and kind of wealthy men are just sort of, idle, and that idleness and that focus on kind of, as I mentioned, property and honors and appearance and, what society thought of them or all of that, really kept them from doing kind of carrying out those really important duties. Again, I mean, virtue is, I mean, I've mentioned it so many times, but it really is the central feature. She sees that all institutions, marriage and parenthood and social institutions, political institutions ought to be designed with the development of humans' virtue foremost in mind, because that will be what leads to their own personal happiness, to familial happiness, and to societal happiness. So, yeah, that's right. She's very much wants men and women, because of the good that comes from them attending to each other in marriage, but then also attending to their children, the way in which they're developed. And there's some really beautiful lines she has about and paying attention to the development of one's child and the virtue, and inculcating virtue in your children, then you too begin to see where you might grow as well. And she says it much more artfully than that, but I think she really has, as one who has many children myself, who've been very focused on raising children. I really see that in myself, especially teenagers. Help you grow, but so do caring for very young children. So she saw that very clearly.
And before she'd even had a child herself as well. That's what's really
Mm,
amazing, actually, about
hmm. It's
about
true.
her insight into, yeah, because I know what she means. Yeah. Um, what did she have to say on male physical strength as well as a crucial, um, a biological difference between the sexes?
Yeah, so she's very clear that it's not just reproductive differences and the ways in which, again, carrying out those distinctive duties could form a maternal and paternal character very distinctively, but that men have greater physical strength than women. It's very clear. And she kind of says, so why do they have to, you know, um, jump on more and kind of hold down women more by not giving them the kind of education they need, to really live according to their kind of noble purpose as human beings. But it's interesting because she actually says, with regard to physical strength, that perhaps that means that men could attain more virtue than women, and she leaves that up to a chance. And Sarah Grimke does something similar, where we don't know really, what women are capable of morally and intellectually, because they haven't, at that time, they weren't given kind of the intellectual and moral formation that they ought to be, and that they were kind of held as dependents, or as just sort of, they ought to, as Rousseau thought, just sort of listen to their husbands or their fathers, and not be sort of given the formation, as she did in that female reader, she wanted to do for women, and young, and for young girls, to have that kind of independence of mind that would, she thought, help them be really interested in carrying out those duties to their children. That she was confident that were they given this education, that's what they would be focused on, because they would understand what their end is as human beings, and that they would understand how happiness would come from that. I don't know that that's how it's gone, but I think part of that is because our education system really moved away from forming human beings for virtue, and very much took that same technological turn, really thinking about human beings as consumers and producers, and not as friends and spouses and parents. And that's been a real shame, because all of her vision, not just for women and for men, but just sort of for what it is to be human, I think that we've forgotten all of that, which is part of what I'm trying to do in my book, The Rights of Women, is in reclaiming that lost vision. It's reclaiming, what it is to be human in a really full sense, and what, human happiness and flourishing consists in.
That's such a lovely note to end on. So, in the extended bit of the episode, I want to talk a bit more about your biography and your intellectual and ideological journey, which is really interesting. Um, for everyone else, uh, where can people find more of your work? And also, if people are interested in this pre-20th century feminism, we've mentioned quite a few names, um, in terms of early suffragists and so on. But do you think that there, aside from Wollstonecraft, is there maybe one or two other women that you think really, really ought to be read more than they are?
Yeah, so I mean, I would say my first important suggestion is to go and find Wollstonecraft's work. If you want to start with the Vindication of the Rights of Women, go for it, but certainly read original stories as well. And but don't read the introductions that editors have put there. Go and read her words themselves. I think that's really important. I would also try to find, and it's hard to find, I'm actually working on an anthology of these early women thinkers, because as you say, they have been memory holed. And so it's hard because sometimes it's like I'm asking people to rely on my own scholarship, and sometimes people just want to read them for themselves. So trying to find Sarah Grimke's work, I think, would be really, really advantageous for people. So her letters on the equality of the sexes, her essay Marriage. Reach out to me if you are just dying to find them, and I'll point you to a PDF that I have. And then in terms of my work, so I direct the Wollstonecraft Project at the Abigail Adams Institute, where we actually have, in the last 6 months, launched a journal, which we say is your source for sex realist feminism, called Fair Disputations. Louise is part of that, and other great thinkers, Mary Harrington, Nina Power, Abigail Favale, many of whom, I think all of those you've had on your podcast already.
Eventually, we'll get everyone associated with Fair
Yeah.
Disputations will come on the podcast at some
Yeah, it's
point.
really good. And then you can also find my essays at the Ethics and Public Policy Center, a Washington, D.C. think tank, which has kind of an individual website dedicated to my writing.
Erika, that was wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Louise.
Thank you so much for watching that episode of Maiden, Mother, Matriarch, and for all of your support. It means an enormous amount for the growth of the show. If you want to hear bonus content, an extra 20, 30 minutes of conversation with the guest, maybe a little bit more personal, a little bit less filtered, then you can go to my Substack at louiseperry.substack.com, where you can sign up for extended episodes and also bonus episodes. And you can also access our chat community. You can also support the show by subscribing on YouTube or subscribing wherever you get your podcasts, and rating and reviewing on Apple Podcasts is also really great for encouraging other people to give the show a try. Please also spread the word, tell people that you know who you think might like it to give it a shot. The word of mouth effect is really valuable, so we'd really appreciate it. Thank you so much, everyone, for listening, watching, and supporting what we're doing.